Been a while, eh? I've always had this peculiar fascination with Game of Thrones, even before I was allowed to watch it. There was something so fantastical about the world building, character dynamics, and large plot threads that I heard so much about via YouTube videos regarding the subject. As such, I yearned to watch it, and only just now got around to doing so. And for the majority of this time, I really did quite enjoy this show.
Hello guys, you know what time it is? Disco time!
Half of it is some of the best television I've ever viewed. With that said, the other half is an abortion from a writing standpoint. I still enjoyed it because my friends were simultaneously watching it with me and we could complain, but the fire, the spark that it once had, was no longer lit. It's disappointing seeing such a great show fall because its writers were promised Star Wars.
Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
So in turn, they decided to dream speedrun to the end faster than I'd run from a homeless man in a Wendy's parking lot. It's not just Season 8 as people would let on. In fact, it's everything after the introduction of Season 5. I was debating either doing Season 8, Episode 3, or Season 8, Episode 5, titled The Long Night and The Bells, respectively, but ended up going with The Long Nights because at least in The Bells, there was some sense of visual spectacle that I could latch onto. If you shut your brain off and pretend you're in a vegetative state clinging to life support, it's actually quite a fun watch. With that said, I couldn't see a single thing in The Long Nights because of how dark it was, and I know that many people complain about the brightness, but it was their job to prepare these things on set. Enough of my rambles. Let's begin.
Watching people die, I cannot look or see. Covering my eyes, I hear the distant scream. Plugging both my ears, but the sound bleed. Crying more tears than it is raining. Throw it all away, could tell you didn't care. Is that all you got? Love when it ain't fair. Move me out and crop the picture never there. People love to talk, but never wanna square. Tell me what you want, baby, tell me what you need. Going through it all, everything is out of reach. Engaging in a fight, everyone is scared of me. They will never know, deep down I'm only weak. Please just hear me out, can you promise me one thing? I can never win if you promise you'll never leave. Baby, I'm alone, does life have any meaning? Falling through the cracks and slipping right through the seams. Stepping on the gas, quarter of a tank. I got a ways to go, but I know I have the strength. Not in crowds or packs, to if even that. I fight all by myself, capable of what I have. Going pissed off, risking my life. Stranded, panic, tracking the time. Dangerous hatred, kill and divide. This is not what I had in. Bleeding out, mission abort. Loose ties, cutting the cord. Stable, carry support. I don't care if this all distorts. Contradict yourself, you make no sense. So try to get me to talk, but I'm so dense. Share my thoughts with the floor and think again. My depression is war.
The episode begins with Sam being presented a dagger and ordered to move into battle. I commend this Warner opening, allowing us to see the environment in which the living are preparing for battle. Sam has a feeling of reluctance about him, being not fully trained in combat. Some of the other men order the soldiers around, and not even 30 seconds in, some absolute dimwit commands the women and children to enter the crypt. The crypt. You know, where they house, the dead people. Yeah. In a battle against some Eiffel 65 tool that can resurrect the dead. I suppose the assumption could be made that they presumed no white could break through the ground, but that neglects the fact that the Night King still has an air of mystery about him. You can't make these assumptions when you're battling for the fate of humanity. It would have been arguably better to just send them away from the fortress, because even then, they would have been safer. You're sending your most defenseless people in a glorified entrapment filled with potential zombies. Genuine mental illness. The camera follows Sam in sheer panic, switching over to Tyrion, who's seen walking past Bran in his wheelchair. Tyrion looks at him, as we all did, expecting him to do something badass and conceptual like he did with Hodor. He is going to do something like that. Yes, that's how we'll win, right? It wouldn't make sense for any secondary character to save the day for this plot point on the basis of subversion. Are we in agreement, D&D? Something tells me we're not. The camera pans up into the darkness from Tyrion, giving us our first glimpse into what we're dealing with. A completely pitch black void. Apparently, they spent 55 days on set filming just this one episode. An admirable feat. But for Christ's sake, could you not have placed like a seventh more of your budget into lighting? Because to increase your exposure is to essentially shoot day for night. Oh my god, I literally need to decrease the contrast on my monitor to watch this. A bunch of shots follow this, including ones with Davos, Arya, and Sansa. The Unsullied march forth onto the field, dragons flying overhead, giving you the incorrect prediction that they will serve literally any purpose in this battle besides spectacle. And keep in mind, they've been given a fair bit of preparation time, and it's shown later that Melisandre can literally spawn fire out of thin air on a large scale, as opposed to the smaller one before, so why aren't there more bonfires? Let your men see where they're aiming, for the love of God. And then, for the first time in this episode, you get to see their battle strategy. They have the literal cavalry in the front, followed by trebuchets, followed by the Unsullied, and not once did the most tactical, intelligent, and greatest fighters the world of Westeros has ever seen consider that perhaps there's a strategic flaw to their lineup. The trebuchets should go in the back, and there's like a solid 6 boulders per. This will hold off whites for a fraction of a second. What were you thinking? The next minute or so is once more devoted to shots of various characters we, as the audience, care about in the hopes that it'll elicit dread. Fewer and fewer characters of importance have died every season after the beauty of the fourth. So why should I suspect that they're in any legitimate danger now? I'm going to praise them briefly here for the wide still of the armies lined together. The darkness of the background creates a scale that's been unmatched by any other fantasy show or movie. I'd give this more praise if it weren't for the fact that there's a single trench line in the background. Could they not have made multiple, or at the very least reinforced the one they have? My niece could have done better, and she has cataracts. There are no viable methods of retreat should they be overrun. This battle formation works heavily under the pretense that they will win. Cutting away from the battle momentarily, we see Jon walking to Dany with both dragons held behind. Perhaps that's why this battle plan is so god-awful. Jon was too busy wanting that Dragusi from Dany to think straight. In fact, that would explain the entirety of his actions in these past 2 seasons, so I guess it's plausible. The introductory portion of this battle drags on for quite a while, as they're driving to shove as many notable characters as possible into the spotlight for the limited time they have per their request. This whole conflict did not need to merely span a singular episode. It could have gone on for far longer, taking up potentially half a season if it needed to. Right now, it's working on the character development of previous seasons to build its hype, rather than the skirmish of the present. It doesn't need to do this. D&D had the budget for a full-length season, but I guess Star Wars is a more profitable IP. Davos appears to be looking at something in particular. Oh, what's that? It's Melisandre coming from enemy lines. Where the hell did you come from? I don't think we've been shown that she has the ability to teleport, although other characters have unlocked fast travel. That's a different problem in of itself. So how can she come from the darkness to greet the Dothraki? The only way for her to do this is to literally walk around the army far enough to not be seen, go horizontally across it, and finally come back in, all at a snail's pace in the heat of war on a battlefield where her enemy's location is unknown. And keep in mind, this is all in the pursuit of a cool visual. So, I'm going to froth at the mouth. Anyway, she asks Jorah if he's capable of speaking Dothraki, to which he nods his head, listening as she requests that all their swords be lifted. Walking up, she grips one of the blades, remarkably not piercing her hand in the slightest, speaking High Valyrian, as every single Dothraki weapon gets coated in a flame. Where did you obtain this ability? No, wait, more importantly, why did you not use this ability to fortify your goddamn trenches? I suppose Lightbringer could be brought up as an example, but there was nothing to this scale. Rather, they should have been given Valyrian steel or maybe dragon glass, because those have been shown to be effective against the whites. What's even better is that this development was unexpected to the Dothraki. They fully expected to rampage into the battlefield with zero visibility and come out on top because of, plot, I guess. They don't know how many enemies there are or when they'll charge forth at them. There was no planning. The only reason this scene exists is to look cool. The scene turns to Sam and Ed. Sam wearing his usual confused face and Ed wearing his usual smug grin. Why they needed to be seen is entirely lost to us, and their appearance is immediately forgotten as we see Melisandre and Grey Worm's next interaction. While seeming to hold some kind of significance, it doesn't. It simply ends up as a poor attempt at subtlety and foreshadowing. It could have potentially been interesting seeing these two characters come together to fight as a unit, considering all of them are here in one location, something unheard of in previous seasons. As such, it would have been beneficial to see some new interactions, but obviously that's asking for too much. As the next few agonizing seconds play out, Davos even allows Melisandre into the keep, despite his distrust and vow to execute her. For such a tactically capable individual, this action comes off as out of character, to say the least. He's an intelligent person, meaning she would have been let in eventually, but there should have been a hint of hesitation considering their history. Small wonder, really, that Davos let Melisandre in, as over the next few long moments, after Melisandre makes her way through the gates, Davos hurries to face her, with a countenance bordering on constipation. It seems that there was little thought in Davos's head when he let Melisandre in, further evidenced by his utter speechlessness throughout their encounter. Melisandre, of course, being the usual cryptic sorcerer of every fantasy story, leaves him saying, "I will be dead by the end of tonight."
There's no need to execute me. I'll be dead before the dawn.
This was an opportunity to be utilized to allow these two characters who've been bickering since Season 2 to have their final moments together. There'd be no chance for this on the battlefield. The writers purposefully leaving this scene vague to both maintain consistent viewership and add to the feeling that something riveting is to come. It's not that this portion is bad, so much as it's underutilized. Afterwards, Melisandre takes a cursory glance towards the fortifications, and Arya and her eyes meet. In all honesty, this moment seems much more in context, as in Season 3, Melisandre tells Arya that she will kill many people. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, eyes you'll shut forever. We'll meet again.
You're a witch.
I see a darkness in you, and in that darkness, eyes staring back at me. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. Eyes you'll shut forever. We will meet again.
It's quite clear at this moment that the writing of the earlier seasons was in it for the long game, preparing for encounters far off in the future. By contrast, the writing of this episode feels almost rushed, despite its long, drawn-out scenes, almost as if the writing and filmography team were given zero contact. It's as if the show is teasing us, and I know this because Arya stares her down as if there's something to say, but no. That'd be too much work. The writers really want you to believe that this episode is where everything comes to a head. They want you to feel the anticipation of all the main cast finally meeting each other. If they were competent, they would have provided dialogue as the earlier seasons did, rather than vacant observations. In the next scene, Arya returns to Sansa's side, looking over the edge of the wall. At last, the Dothraki ride, blinking torchlights in the distance. What follows is an excellent display of overhead shots and in the midst of battle shots, which leave the watcher in awe. However, the watcher is also left with a sense of confusion as they wonder why exactly the Dothraki charged anyway. There's no scene in which we saw the walkers emerge from the darkness, and not so much as a hint that they would take off. In fact, it doesn't even seem that there's a coherent battle plan, which would line up with the brash nature of the Dothraki, but it does not make sense for a contingent led by Jorah Mormont, a Westerosi king in nature and strategy, to charge so wildly at something they cannot see. The scene turns to Jon and Dany on their cliff, looking down at the Dothraki charge. Then we cut to the Unsullied setting the trebuchets alight and releasing them. The camera rises up from the center of the Unsullied troops, and we can see the flaming ordnance fly into the sky. Truly, this is an excellent shot, as it elicits this epic image of the battlefield. In the scene, the darkness gives the flames an almost ethereal glow, which serves to accentuate the intensity of the scenario. The next part, though, is a bit ironic. We see Jorah and the Dothraki ride into the night, with Ghost riding alongside them. They do indeed have quite the grandiloquent figure. However, mere seconds later, they meet the others in the battle. And just as the expression of the first Dothraki to encounter them indicates, they are immediately overwhelmed. If you shut your brain off, this scene is fantastic. Ramin Djawadi does such a superb job with the score, the orange and black juxtaposing in such a beautiful way, but again, it's all visual spectacle, void of any true content. As well as this, if you look at the overhead shot, you can see that the Dothraki are completely outmatched. There's a visible magnitude differential between the number of Dothraki and whites, and of course, they couldn't have done anything to change this, but it would certainly require backup, or at least a more consistent onslaught of trebuchet shots. From Jon and Dany's vantage, we see the clash moments after its beginning, and see the lights break formation as if a dark arrow has pierced its center. At last, the trebuchet engineers yield to a ceasefire, and we see the last lights of the initial conflict die out. Everyone else just kind of stands around aimlessly, watching as the entirety of their cavalry falls, as if they have no objective. The very least they could do is continue to fire the trebuchets. It's not like they're going to hit some of their own men. In the last moment of the first clash, the camera cuts to each of the leaders. First to Grey Worm, then to Sandor Clegane, to Lord Beric Dondarrion, and at last to Jaime Lannister. What this scene is supposed to do is show us the confusion on each of their faces as the lights of the swords go out, but every single person they pan to is so hopelessly stoic that it's hard to feel anything. It's like the writers couldn't decide between making the characters seem ruthless and physically able, or helpless, so they chose both, switching from shot to shot. Although that does change when it cuts to Jaime, who does in fact look confused, so good job, Mr. Nikolaj. We then cut to the still bewildered Sam and Ed, who at the extinguishing of the lights takes on a much more sober expression. While this does get across that distressing air, it does so only for a moment, as the scene again cuts to more stoic, burly men, which serves to confuse our interpretation even more. But at last, something actually happens, and the Dothraki horses begin to race back to the front lines, with the few remaining Dothraki riders in tow. The next 10 to 20 seconds are spent in near silence, as the last of the initial party ride go back, with a slow-motion appearance of a battered Jorah. We don't actually see Ghost, but it's safe to assume he's alive because, plot armor, if you haven't caught on yet. What astonishes me is that Jorah survived, regardless of the fact that he was still in the front charge. He should be dead. There was absolutely no way he survived this, similar to how Jon survived the Battle of the Bastards. D&D described it as, quote, luck. So I guess that's a valid excuse in a tightly written narrative now. Seeing this, Dany turns around only to be stopped by Jon, telling her that the Night King is coming, implying that her battle is won against the Night King. Dany ignores this and Jon takes it like the simp he is. The previous Jon would have some level of agency in the scene, asking her not to irrationally wander off without him. The next few moments are shot very well, and the expressions of the soldiers really do make your heart sink as Sandor Clegane steps back, readying his shield, and you see the other soldiers, the ones that were stoic earlier, take shallow, hesitant breaths. This, at least, was done well. The tension builds in silence for a few long moments, as Grey Worm dons his helmet, his breaths visibly shallow, his expression tense. This should be one of the most tense moments of the show, but it's ruined because I know no one will die. Or rather, if someone does, it'll be someone minor. Plus, they'll have no viable method of long-range attack anymore, since the trebuchets will be destroyed first. At that point, they'll be limited to their army and a single trench line in the back. They know they're on the verge of ambush, meaning some people will naturally want to flee. But they can't do that because this battle plan was designed by a blind quadriplegic. At last, the others emerge from the darkness, the wind crescendoing as the Unsullied prepare their spears for battle. The others make contact, and distress ensues. Walker and Unsullied fall left and right. Well, actually, it's more just it's mostly just the Unsullied, but it's quite hard to tell, as most of what we see is either too dense or too dark to comprehend. That's one of the problems with power scaling. For this initial push, it makes sense from a narrative standpoint to make it appear as the living are losing. The issue that stems is that they lean a little too far into that. For the most part, it's a lot of violence, which ends up being less confusing in the way that large-scale battles are, and more confusing in the sense that we have literally no idea what's going on, because we barely see what's happening. The only thing that the audience will be able to recognize is that the Unsullied are losing, since the Walkers are far too numerous. What makes it more baffling is that the White Walkers didn't hit the lines at the same time. Tormund straight up watches the Unsullied get owned by the Walkers for a few seconds, then hops into battle when the Walkers finally make it to his front. I don't actually mind this, as it makes the scene retain intensity throughout. This is shortly followed by a cut to Brienne of Tarth, who yells to her soldiers to stand their ground. That makes sense tactically, but I still have a problem with the weird fluidity of her first sword swing. It doesn't really make sense that she would start the battle off with a detrimental upward cut, but hey, I'm no swordsmaster. It's as if she's swinging rubber. It's also as if her armor does piss all. Do your thing, I guess. Following the wave of walkers, utter bewilderment ensues, even worse than when the Unsullied first engaged. On top of the brightness, sorry, it really is bad. What little we can see are little flashes of flame on what look like swords, but again, it's hard to tell. As far as I can see, with the brightness turned up, I might add, Jaime is wildly swinging his sword at walkers until Brienne is tackled by one. Okay, wait, hold on. Brienne is a fan-favorite character, and rightfully so. There's no way they can kill her off, right? I mean, she looks pretty dead here. Even the most skilled swordsman would not be able to come out of this scenario. She's cornered in every facet of her being by a force that has no comprehension of fear. She's dead, yes? Right? Jaime comes to her rescue, taking the walker off her. Yes, not the 10 some odd that were there prior. But I guess I was right in my assumption that the writers would be unwilling to kill off any character. And then, oh my god. Goddamn flashbang. Do you not care if your viewers are epileptic? After turning the brightness down, we can see now that the dragons came in handy. Right? Wrong. Those dragons actually just burnt a path through both the walkers and allied forces, killing dozens upon dozens of combatants. Sure, a bunch of walkers are dead, but was that really a good idea? I mean, the shot looks cool and all, but it just doesn't make any sense from a tactical standpoint. And why not do this before? When they were charging. Jon and Dany were standing, watching from above as the Dothraki were slaughtered. Could you not have gone down? I suppose this could have been out of fear of the appearance of the Night King, but that's where strategy comes into play. One dragon killing the whites, one preparing for the revived dragon. It's that simple. The destructive force of one dragon is unmatched by any other thing in this universe. Might as well utilize it. After killing dozens of their own soldiers, Dany and Jon leave the battlefield, heading towards a line of walkers in the front of the forest. After the others spot the dragons, a massive blizzard rolls in, just like magic. Is this ever explained? No, but surely it'll be explained later. Surely they'll confront the Night King about his powers and learn some more history beyond what Bran could find. Right? Jon and Dany are battered around a bit, but end up largely unscathed. At this point, their plot armor is so thick, I'm surprised they even need dragons and just can't, fly around like they turned on creative mode or something. What follows, though, is a fairly epic shot of the dragons breathing fire down onto the walkers. The reflection off of the blizzard as it rolls over them is visually stunning, and really makes that epic nature hit home. Afterwards, Arya tells Sansa to head to the crypt. I know Arya cares about this person, so why is she sending her to the one place where they legitimately know the dead are? Oh my god. Sansa resists, but Arya hands her a Valyrian dagger. She sensibly realizes that the dagger would do almost nothing against a group of walkers invading the crypts, but Arya simply tells her to stick them with the pointy end. How eloquent.
I don't know how to use it.
Stick 'em with the pointy end.
The score ramps up at this moment, indicating that this is foreshadowing. Now we know for sure that Tyrion and Sansa will fight alongside each other in the crypt. At least, that's what's to be reasonably expected. Although it's unfortunate that such major characters are sent to the sidelines for other characters to take the spotlight. Everyone should be given an equal amount of screen time, especially someone like Sansa. This is the time for her to demonstrate what she's learned as a leader during her brief time as such in Winterfell. It doesn't need to be either she gets screen time with characters she knows, or she gets screen time as a leader. Two aren't mutually exclusive, so I don't know why the writers are treating it this way. Following this exchange, Arya looks down on the battlefield and unslings her bow. The scene cuts to Jaime fighting off whites as the blizzard finally touches down on the battlefront. Realistically speaking, this would imperil the allied forces, and that would reflect in a kind of desperate feeling. However, throughout the entire scene, the screen just shakes a little bit more subtly, and it extinguishes any sense of desperation that we could have potentially had. This should give the whites the upper hand, considering the low visibility most likely affects them less than it would a human. This effect is further nullified by the amount of debris that flies through the scene, which also continues to confuse the shot. What follows is another aerial shot showing a dragon burn a line through the battlefield once more. If you didn't believe me the first time, you better believe me now, because when the dragon flies through that battlefield, it illuminates an undead giant who is presumably swinging its sword at living opponents. Why can't they do more of this? I just can't get past that. It makes no sense. The giant is quickly caught in the crossfire of the flames, and so is whatever he was swinging his sword at. The scene then cuts to the Godswood for a moment as the blizzard overtakes them. The battlefield reappears once more, and the next 2 minutes or so is complete chaos. This next assault begins with Jorah on his horse, swiping away at the others below, and he is thrown off in the midst of battle. After this, we're not very sure what happens. The scene jumps to a lot of people fighting, some even dying. Because of the utter chaos, it's really hard to tell who's dying and if we should even care. I mean, the sheer number of cuts in the scene make it very nearly disorienting to watch. That, coupled with the low lighting and now gray blur that's covered the screen, makes it impossible for me to distinguish between character to character. I know something is happening, it's just difficult to pinpoint what exactly. For a moment though, we spend an extended period of time with Ed and Sam. They're both tackled by whites, and for a moment there, it seems like Sam might just die, but we're clued into the fact that he won't by the high violin in the background, building up to something, and I can guarantee it won't be his death. After all, Sam can't die regardless of his lack of battle experience. In fact, why is he out here in the first place? Shouldn't he be held back or something in turn for a more competent fighter? Or is he only out here because it raises the stakes? It also is strange that for the wide shots, the white count seems incredibly high, but when we close in on individual characters, that number drops drastically, almost like the showrunners are literally gaslighting us. In the end, Ed kills the white on top of Sam. But in a moment of errant stupidity, Sam spends too much time making eye contact on an active battlefield, and Ed is stabbed through his back. I didn't like this part, to be honest. Not because it's bad, but because it's okay. I got this kind of metallic taste in my mouth when it happened. It was so visceral and sudden, and I actually felt sad that Ed died. They don't give you much time to dwell on it, though, as the battle quickly begins again. He might not have been the most major character, but damn, you could have spent more time devoted to his death. It's still like a big event, and it adds to the overall tally of people who died in this episode. It's still, matters. D&D only care about the characters they care about, and disregard any others. This is as clear as day. Well, no, excuse me, let me rephrase. It's as clear as a burning building, example of that, but that doesn't roll off the tongue as well. However, the episode cuts to Sansa as she goes down the steps into the crypts. In stark contrast to the last several minutes, this scene is instead spent in complete silence. The next minute is only noted by the footsteps of the people in the crypt, and at last Tyrion taking a swig from his wine bladder. The old Tyrion would have made a witty joke about this circumstance, especially considering his background. I mean, a fight between the living and the dead would have seemed absurd to Season 1 Tyrion. Moreover, Sansa and him should be given more to do. He doesn't even need to fight. Given his stature, it would be more burdensome to put him in the field, but he deserved some dialogue in the crypt. You can't just ignore the fact that he's a legitimate character with him taking a swig of alcohol, as if that relieves you of writing duties. You sly bastards. In fact, this would demonstrate to me and the audience that you don't know how to tell a joke that doesn't have to do with the fact that multiple characters on the show are eunuchs. I don't care. I really don't care. Just make him tell a joke that doesn't have the word cock in it. We then cut to Jon riding the dragon into the blizzard. Because flying blind is a bad idea, ask 9/11 survivors. I'm sorry. I'm gonna cut that out. They nearly crash, just barely keeping themselves off of the ground, making contact with the tops of the trees. Once more, these characters should be dead. The dragons are now navigating purely on their own intuition, since there's no chance Jon or Dany can prepare for oncoming debris. These winds are very evidently strong enough to kill someone, let alone push the two off their dragons. After pulling up from the trees, Dany and Jon collide midair, because they both thought it was a good idea to attack the Night King simultaneously. This isn't Dany's battle. Nothing of her previous storyline was leading up to this. It's Jon's job to pursue the Night King. That's the point of his character. Dany should have stayed back and guaranteed that the other fighters survived. Not that it matters though, because they carry on just as they were. After a few more seconds of flight, we go back to the battlefield, as Brienne and Tormund call for the troops to fall back. For quite possibly the first time in this episode, we see a strategic win. With the Unsullied ordered to protect the retreat, the remaining forces are given a liberal berth so that they make it into Winterfell. How they manage to do so, though, remains a point of contention. The onslaught is still continuing. It's not like the Whites will halt to give the others an opportunity to flee. At the very least, one should have gotten through their defenses. The Unsullied practice excellent discipline and fight off the onslaught of walkers long enough for most of the army to withdraw. They shouldn't be able to do this, but whatever. Some may say that it wasn't a great idea to allow the armies back in, but pushing the walkers through a smaller space is tactically advantageous, especially when the armies of Winterfell are at a disadvantage. In the words of Sun Tzu, yeah, I'm gonna quote him, "Move not unless you've seen it."
Masters of Spinjitzu. Move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. Fight not unless the position is critical.
Remarkably, they follow legitimate war advice. Was that racist? Is that like bad? I'm not. The scene pans up and over the walls of Winterfell and scrolls to the front of the Unsullied lines. However, we don't make it to the front as we actually end up with Jon, who calls out to Dany. He, of course, doesn't get a response because, he called out in a blizzard. We then see Bran from an aerial view as he looks around and up to Jon's dragon as Jon touches back down on the walls of Winterfell. He has a look on his face that indicates he knows something that we don't. He's been in this state for the entirety of the season, wrongfully indicating that he'll do anything during this battle. I'm alright with the fact that he's practically desolate as of recent, but this should impact his character. He has a direct connection to the Night King and can see through all of time and space. You can't tell me you're not going to use that. As well as this, a detail I glossed over was the fact that Jon had known about the blizzard attack preemptively from his battle at Hardhome. That's where all the whites had come from initially. Regardless of this never being fully explained and potentially being an asshole considering how it's not part of the books, Jon should have alerted the others about this capability instead of leaving them stranded and helpless. If they had known this was a power within the Night King's repertoire, I'm sure they would have planned for such. Or maybe not, considering how this battle plan was created. We see the remaining troops return to Winterfell, and Jaime and Brienne fall to the sides to watch the return, and ensure that no enemies fall through. However, in a rather confusing decision, Brienne pulls one of her troops to the side who was previously retreating. She then tells them to continue retreating. Jaime, though, has the sense to simply keep telling them to retreat and not pulling them aside to do so. Also, here's a brief side rant, nothing objective. Lyanna Mormont is incredibly out of place in every scene she's in. I can see someone of her age ruling, albeit not very well, but her demeanor is so atypical of anyone in that pre-established age group. Furthermore, why is she out here in the first place? The same logic applies to Tyrion. In fact, Tyrion has a far more substantial position than her, and he's still left to fend for himself in the crypt. She shouldn't be allowed out here. It's both insanely dangerous, and she has no genuine combat experience. The next few cuts are really hard to discern, as there is a lot of battle perplexion. Not much actually happens, as the battle simply continues, the Unsullied fending off the hordes. We get an ascending shot of the battlefield, and this bit is supposed to show the scale of the Whites' army, but it is so dark that it is incredibly difficult to make out anything more than some gray and black blobs. As the shot returns to the retreating troops, Sandor Clegane is one of the last to return. Arya aims a shot from the top of the battlements, one that we are supposed to think may be aimed at the Hound. However, whether it's a result of bad writing or bad pacing, this doesn't take much effect, as we know that Arya removed Sandor Clegane from her kill list after she believed he had died at the hands of Brienne of Tarth. This, I assume, was supposed to be joking at him being killed by her. Arya admits that she had no desire to see him dead in an earlier episode. That's not why I think this is poorly written, though. I think it's poorly written because it reiterates a point that's already been made clear in other scenes. They have some form of affection for each other, no matter how brutal. Despite this, we don't need to be shown again. We've known that Arya is a skilled assassin. We've known of her history with the Hound. We've known that they're somewhat reluctant to speak to each other, so what purpose does this serve beyond explaining the basics? This next minute ends with the last of the Winterfellian armies retreating to the keep. In the beginning of the next minute, Grey Worm gazes at the last failing lines of the Unsullied. Fortunately, we can see what's happening, and for several moments, Grey Worm deliberates whether or not he should sacrifice his men for the greater purpose of finalizing the trench and setting fire to it. He does call for the trench to be lit, and soon enough that it remains effective. This one shot also reveals the power scaling issue in a much more evident light. Before we were shown the differing scales, and that was enough to indicate that the battle would be moving in favor of the Night King, but this legitimately shows how destructive the Whites are when it's necessary. They were busting through the lines with insane ease, cracking each row in mere seconds, and these are the strongest warriors Winterfell has. There's a moment of panic for Grey Worm, which is a detail I can appreciate. Dany, being high above the sky for whatever reason, can't see the signal to light the flames. Realizing this, Davos tells the archers to light them, but because of the wind and the lack of accelerant in the trenches, they are not lit. So Failing that plan, Davos then sends men to light them with torches, but because the trenches are pretty much ineffective at this point, Whites make their way through and take out many of the people lighting the trenches. The trenches still remain unlit, and Grey Worm begins to panic. He sees Melisandre in the midst of the crowd. Why is she just standing there and not aiding the battle even when it's incredibly clear that it needs to be done? Her purpose, as she calls it, is to destroy the darkness and find the prince that was promised. There's a sense of urgency to that. This is her opportunity to achieve that goal that she's been yearning for however many years. She's kept herself alive in this state to attain this one feat, and now that it's come, she's loitering? Whether it be for drama, or if she's contemplating her life, this is the time for her to move. Not doing so is contradictory to her character's motivation. We see some Whites break through the trench, because at this point it hasn't been lit yet. We also see, in multiple other shots, that they're moving in one line. So why are they not all breaking through at once? The Unsullied, as well as Sandor, Jaime, Jorah, and Beric form a phalanx, so that Melisandre can use her magic powers or whatever to do a thing. Props to the directors for actually using her ability more than once, but that doesn't stop it from being a deus ex machina. Why do they have enough time to do this when the Whites are cutting through the trenches? That's a great question. Melisandre chants in High Valyrian as the camera pans upward to the dark battlefield. The scenario makes an attempt to instill the scene with desperation, which apparently is the only emotion the scene directors know. However, because Melisandre is quite literally magic, it doesn't feel that way. Instead, it feels like this false front is put up to dismiss abysmal writing. Along with this, how is it that at the exact moment the Whites reach the trenches, the flame is lit? The very last moment, to be exact. Almost like that storytelling technique I just mentioned. Piss off, show. There's a redeeming factor of this event, though. Not only are the trenches lit, but a fair amount of time is spent looking at the Hound. Wait, hold on. Are those Whites moving through fire? Do the showrunners know that fire is their kryptonite and that there is literally no possible way that they'd be able to simply move through it in this regard? Yes, they are dying, and will eventually die within a minute or so, but don't forget that they burst into flames. They do not simply take more damage from being inflamed. Their whole body catches fire, and they become far more sporadic. Whatever. Due to Sandor's pyrophobia, a look of fear crosses his face as the trenches catch fire. On top of his fearful expression, the Whites simply stop crossing the trench, standing eerily at the edge. It all adds up to this satisfyingly eerie feeling. I legitimately like this. It's a good addition to the episode and makes sense for his character. As Clegane leaves, the scene cuts to Tyrion standing under an arch in the crypt, and the scene cuts to Sansa, Varys, and the other miscellaneous citizens taking shelter in the crypts. Sansa, being an intelligent individual, tells Tyrion that if he goes topside to fight, he'll die and join the undead legions of the Whites. Tyrion, being his saucy self, denies that he'll join the others in death, stating that he wouldn't exactly fit in with their target demographic. Sansa says that they'll all die if they fight up there. What are you talking about? You certainly have more ability than Lyanna Mormont, whatever her name is, so why is she up there and why are you down here? Jon would let you fight. What are you doing? The exchange continues, Tyrion remembering the day back in Season 3 when they were to marry. Sansa's cautious and frankly nihilist nature appeals to Tyrion in this moment, him saying that they should have stayed married. Sansa, while seeing some advantage in this, notes that their allegiances would tear them apart, Sansa as the ruler of the North, and Tyrion as the hand of the Queen to Dany. Missandei, or my Sunday, as people, I don't know why people, that's a weird name, angered by the slight at their savior, leaves in a huff after telling them that they wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Dany. I don't have a big issue with this scene beyond the absurdity of Tyrion pledging his allegiance to Dany. As Hand of the Queen, they've done nothing but disagree with each other at every turn. Dany has been working on her own volition, departed fully from Tyrion's ideas. At a certain point long ago, D&D started shifting people into aligning with Dany's values to reach the end goal of the Mad Queen. The episode cuts back to the Godswood, where Theon tells Bran that the trench is now lit. What follows is the culmination of long seasons spent waiting for Theon's redemption. After betraying Winterfell to his father, he is then also betrayed, spending time tortured and degraded by Ramsay Bolton. He is saved, but he spends a long time regretting his actions. In one of the last exchanges he and Bran will have, he expresses his regret to Bran, and Bran tells him that his actions brought him here, to where he is now, where he belongs. Home. As much as Bran plays a Christ figure, this is one of the few events that was very well written, especially in the later seasons. You can tell that George had this event planned out, written long ago, as it is so meaningful. Very few characters are truly forgiven, and Bran's forgiveness means all that much more. Theon is a character that wasn't fully butchered by the later seasons. Rather, his character has remained in a state of limbo for some time now. Perhaps it's me being too optimistic, but I had hoped that he would move out of this phase and come back to reality at some point. Although the next bit plays out weirdly. Bran, being an individual who is distant from the real world because of his position as the Three-Eyed Raven, says that he's going to leave. The way Bran says it is so oddly distant, as if it was said by an entranced child, with no inflection at all. That might have been the intent of the directors, but it is so off-putting even for Bran. Bran wargs into a raven and flies over the battlefield in what I imagine is an epic shot, but like the majority of the scenes, it is far too dark. However, after some very hard to see flying, we see the Night King stretch his arm out to the battlefield. An argument could be made that he warged into these ravens so the Night King would know his location, subsequently leading to his demise. But this doesn't make sense, since we know that the Night King already has Bran's location on standby from when they touched in Season 6. So, what's the purpose of the warg? We never find out. The Night King tells the Whites on the battlefield to begin walking over the trenches. This is an assumption, as he doesn't actually say anything, but we can infer it. Though, if this is true, it would indicate that the Whites work in a hive mind of some sort, which contradicts the fact that they didn't move in a single line and instead zigzagged like a barcode at the Unsullied. In all honesty, this is an excellent plan from the Night King, as the Whites are effectively disposable. He presumably has hundreds, even thousands of others at his command, and ordering a few to make a bridge over the fire is a very intelligent tactic, in theory. As seen in Season 7, they won't move forward unless there's an indication that it's safe to move forward. I'm okay with disregarding this, since it's clear they're under the command of the Night King. What I'm not okay with is how they're now impervious to fire. This continues on for a long time, and unfortunately it seems that the Whites aren't very good at taking orders, as not all of them go to the same place. But for such a powerful being, you'd think the Night King could direct his soldiers better. But the real question is, how are a mere 6 or so Whites able to knock out the fire below? How are they capable of this feat, and why are they not doused in flame? They should be, because this is what was shown in previous seasons, qualifying the reason for their ability to penetrate the fortress as a dreaded plot hole. Furthermore, why is the trench not reinforced more? It's literally less thick than the Whites. Could you not have made it wider? And the people on the wall are distraught. What did you think would happen? I suppose this, too, can be ignored, because I assume they thought the Whites wouldn't be able to move through the fire, since, they're not supposed to be able to move through the fire. Davos orders the soldiers to man the wall, preparing for the coming onslaught of Whites. You would think that maybe Dany and her dragon would protect the front lines a bit better, as her dragon, can breathe a fire. That's like their main ability. But apparently she has more important things to do. It's very clear where the fire needs to be now. All that needs to be done is to line off the section between the trench and the fortress. They can't fall on it and put it out, and even if they can, simply relight it. Dragons are so powerful, you'd think they'd be used more. And don't even get me started on Jon's inaction. He's looking out over the battlefield on a fire-breathing dragon and literally does nothing. We can only hope that the soldiers of Winterfell are better at defending their charges. In another spectacular move by Jon, he straight up just watches the Night King and undead Viserion descend from the clouds. Although, we can forgive him, as it's hard to see even for us. Aha. But then again, he doesn't even need to be in view. It's like he swung down to be seen and then moved away knowing Jon would follow him, as if that would benefit him in some regard. The smarter move here would be to immediately go to Bran above, since no one can see him, fly down, incinerate him, and book it out of there. Why they didn't do that is beyond me. In the next scene, we see the Whites take on a suitably World War Z tactic and start climbing up the walls of the keep. Unfortunately for the Whites though, Brienne and Jaime hop up onto the walls, preparing themselves to be probably the only useful force against the Whites. Of course, the other soldiers make an attempt at being useful, and strategically speaking, the archers do their job, retreating to higher ground so they aren't defenseless when the Whites overtake the wall. But they weren't really doing anything to the Whites in the first place, as we see only 10 to 15 go down out of the thousands of Whites, and that failure is further accentuated by the fact that more than 15 arrows were fired. The next minute or so is spent fighting Whites as they climb up the wall and leave themselves virtually defenseless. Because of this, wee little Sam actually manages to get a kill. Look at him go! Of course, not every warrior on the wall is a Jaime Lannister, so a fair few of the soldiers need saving, which the adequate soldiers take care of immediately. The ineptitude of the front line pretty much tells us that Winterfell will be overrun. The next minute or so also consists of a lot of fighting. There's not much to say about it, as not much happens. Although there's a little bit of action when Brienne helps Jaime defeat his aggressors. Then, having been newly saved, Jaime then went to save Sam, as he was also being assaulted by more than one White. As the scene develops, the others do manage to break through the line, as we expected. Truly, the only thing that can save them now is plot magic. One question I have, though, is how the Whites are managing to fall down and not lose any of their limbs. They're still human, albeit somewhat, and a lot of their skeleton is revealed through their decaying skin. Wouldn't that lead to further losses? The plot is further thickened by meager battle offerings. In all honesty, this is a problem with a lot of the battle scenes, as there's no substance to them. While I applaud the effort to create the longest battle sequence committed to film, those efforts, while satisfying to the average audience, who are likely comatose at the moment, do not live up to a viewer who expects, as I said, more substance in film. This isn't an unreal expectation, as the seasons that followed the books were excellent works. However, as the show moved into previously unstructured territory, it fell apart quite quickly, as we only see some plot details wrapped up, but rarely created. But hey, at least this scene has Arya in it. For a show that prides itself on not having any favorite or main characters, Arya sure is acting like a main character would. The score increases in volume and intensity as she's brought on screen. Indicating to the audience that it's time to cheer, much like a laugh track, ordering the audience when to feel something and when to not. After her appearance, Arya manages to rack up a kill count likely greater than half the soldiers on the battlefield. Her spin moves, whatever they are entirely unnecessary and probably fool the average viewer into believing that she has some kind of prowess in the field. She doesn't, really. She's simply twirling with a staff. That isn't a skill, it's ineffective and wasting energy that can be used for killing Whites. And right now, she seems to be the most effective unit at doing so. We see that Davos is quite surprised at this, as he so far seems unarmed, and Arya comes to his rescue. We then see a short clip of Beric calling out to the Hound, who is still terrified at the thought of fire. There is another major problem with this episode, as the battle actually didn't last that long, but is extended by numerous cuts to several events, one after the other, which are actually happening at the same time. It's quite likely that the Hound retreated back into the keep mere minutes before the Night King sent the Whites to the wall. However, to us, this actually takes upwards of 15 minutes. A lot of scenes are fluff, as I stated earlier and will state later, so that they can meet a goal. A quota, if you will. And as was also said earlier, this does very little for the satisfaction of the plot, and ends up being a drag on the watcher. As the giant that appeared moments earlier begins to ravage the Winterfell soldiers, Beric calls to Sandor to action, putting his fear aside when the Hound believes all is lost. He directs his attention to Arya, who immediately pulls the Hound out of his stupor. Sandor and Arya's relationship as respected allies and warriors gives Sandor, who normally has a very craggy exterior, a soft spot for Arya, as they are very similar, and Sandor feels an odd companionship with Arya, a respect that she gained with her feisty personality and solid personal ground. This next scene with Lyanna is the goofiest thing I've ever set my eyes on. She awkwardly runs at the giant, making direct eye contact and not even attempting to swing her axe at him. Swiftly, the giant grips her in his palm and has the bright idea to lift her directly to his eye, where she then proceeds to stab him. I know the Whites are dumb, or rather, not intelligent, but this is just lousy writing. The White could kill her on sight, not gradually lift her up as if she's a baby getting lifted by her dad. Not like my audience would understand that joke anyway. I'm not certain if this was supposed to come off as a joke or not, but as indicated by the soundtrack, I don't think it was. This wasn't played for laughs. The showrunners genuinely believed that this was a heroic moment worthy of tense music. The scene switches to Jon and Dany, using the same transition as earlier. This is a solid transition, but at this point it's starting to feel a bit overused. The spectacle it once had is now lost, thus resulting in this feeling reiterative. This doesn't detract from the quality of the episode as it may seem from the way I'm referencing it. More so, it's a subjective quality that I wish to criticize. We follow as the two characters fly above the blizzard, searching their surroundings for any hint of the Night King, who promptly reveals himself from below. A surge of inferno bursts from below, very visibly making contact with Dany, although not doing any form of damage. Perhaps it's my vision, but there's very clearly a connection between the blue fire and her dragon. That should inflict some injury, making her unable to fly further. Once he's done with this attack, he proceeds downward and out of frame. Jon and Dany collecting their bearings. Why he didn't continue with this is unknown. Why Jon didn't attempt to defend Dany is unknown. The Night King had the upper hand in this situation, with Jon simply doing nothing to fight back, stuck in a state of shaky cam. The main point of contention for the Night King is the two other dragons. If they're converted, there'd be no way for the living to win. If need be, lure them down to the other White Walkers that stood at the edge of the forest beforehand and fire your spears. It's been shown that you people prefer moving targets as opposed to unmoving ones, especially targets that don't have any people on them as opposed to your entire main cast. But whatever. This is all to say that the Night King isn't fully utilizing his power to its full extent. This next scene is a bit peculiar and goes on for an oddly extended amount of time. Let me explain. So, Arya, who was briefly unconscious before, has now awoken in a library. She very quietly tiptoes around, making careful movements as to not be seen by any of the Whites that have invaded. Already, this premise is contrived and doesn't make much sense, considering there's a battle outside. I checked the fandom page for verification, and it states that, quote, "The fighting has moved away from this part of the castle. as whites shamble about looking for survivors to pick off. The entire fortress is under siege at this moment, and not a single puncture of audio can be let through the open windows and heard by the whites, indicating that the very survivors they're trying to locate are outside and in the midst of combat. That's absurd, considering how very numerous the whites were when they were invading through the trenches. That should be audible to anyone across the fortress, even if it's just a little bit. Moreover, if that isn't the tidbit that helps them shuffle out of the library, then the dragons crying from above certainly will. That's an indication of humanity, even if the noise itself isn't human. Moreover, why are they here in the first place? They were part of the initial line if they could make it so far from the battle, but the battle is where all the survivors are, as stated in the fandom article. They knew where their targets were, and decided to deny going for them in favor of a desolate library. That's evidence enough to prove that this very concept is a contrivance wanted by the writers to prove a point, I guess. Moreover, it further reinforces that the writers wanted Arya to get more screen time devoted to her. Keep in mind that no other character this episode is lonesome. Jon has Dany, Sansa has Tyrion, Grey Worm has his fellow soldiers, so it's clear that D&D are now picking favorites. She's a fan favorite character, though that's not reason enough to devote a whole 5 minutes exclusively to her. I wouldn't have an issue with this if it weren't for the fact that no one gets this amount of screen time besides her. 5 minutes isn't that much time in the grand scheme of things. Hell, this whole show is 8 seasons, though it's substantial considering that this is the final battle, or at least should have been for the whole show. Moreover, that's a tongue twister. It's known to any competent storyteller that scenes should only be left in if they serve the greater narrative at hand, and this scene does not. In fact, it detracts from it, since people needed to be shifted around to get there. This includes Arya, who lost consciousness in the midst of battle. How she got to this location is unknown to the viewer and conceptually leads to this scenario. I'm certain many of you have heard the statement, "kill your darlings," when referencing revising stories. This is an example of someone not doing that. When condensing your first draft, you must consider whether this scene serves a purpose, a form of justification for its inclusion. That can be simple as furthering a character dynamic, introducing a new location, or advancing the narrative in some regard. Arya walking through a library does none of that besides perhaps advancing the narrative, though there are many other ways to come to the same conclusion that would have been better. Maybe D&D thought this would create a sense of tension, much more in the same lane as a horror film rather than a history film. But still, that doesn't follow the guidelines previously stated, so its involvement becomes superfluous. Moving away from objectivity, this is the part of the episode during my initial viewing where I got bored enough to turn it off. It was late, and the show wasn't doing me any favors. It wasn't until about a week later that I picked it up, dusted it off, and kept moving. Arya uses a book as a distraction, flinging it across the room to get the attention of the whites. As she turns the corner, one of them pops out, immediately inducing a swift jab with her dagger to the white's throat. Maybe I'm working off technicalities with my next point, but Arya could potentially be killed in this scene, and here's why. Slitting someone's throat does not operate this way. The manner in which it was done still allows for the white to call for reinforcement. In fact, it wouldn't even kill her, just weaken her. This would cause other whites to enter the room, and a battle would ensue. Anyway, she moves from the white and through a doorway, cautiously closing it so as to not alert anyone. Abruptly, dozens of whites come through both doors. I'm not certain why. Arya sprinting away as fast as possible before the scene switches to the crypt. The people inside are looking around, noticing that something is happening beneath the very foundation of the building. Several shots are used to create tension before a booming slam sounds from above. Sansa stands up, hearing innumerable men calling for them to open the door. The whites have moved so far into Winterfell that it's reached the crypt. As Sansa stares, we hear men screaming as whites overrun them. Then, silence. This is an effective scene. It's showing that problems are arising that the women and children hiding will then need to deal with. It builds anticipation for future events. Don't let my praise fool you, because they immediately go back to the worst part about this episode. Arya, Beric, and Sandor are shifting through the halls of the library. This somewhat makes sense. It's entirely possible that Beric followed Sandor into the library as he was trying to flee from the fire. In fact, that's what's hinted at before, so I'm alright with this. In one shot even, Sandor is seen edging away from the flame on Beric's sword, making a face at it before proceeding forth. This is a positive nuance. Arya shoots through the door, whites fully surrounding her and laying on top. Beric throws his sword at the white for some reason. He could have very well walked over in the fraction of the second it would take to reach her and kill them manually. There are more coming, so logically, this would be the move. Tossing the sword in an area that they're about to leave seems silly since it's coated in the very thing that prevents them from living. Beric is stabbed, not given an opportunity to retrieve his sword. This did not need to happen. All of this could have been prevented had he not chucked it, though it had to be left in because it looked cool. The Hound and Arya keep fighting around Beric, even trying to defend him, but it's far too late. He's been stabbed too many times. As such, Sandor grabs Arya and coerces her to leave the site. Again, no sacrifice needed to be made. If their initial position was advantageous and they all had their weaponry, they all could have made it out of this scene alive. This show is teasing us. As the three barge in and try to lock the door, Beric collapses, prompting Arya to grab him and hold him as he slowly dies. From behind, as if out of nowhere, Melisandre comes to speak. Why aren't you out there on the battlefield? You had enough mana to spawn fire on the trenches and for the Dothraki, so what's stopping you from doing so with the swords of the many Unsullied fighting outside? Is there a recharge period? Because surely that's been met if the Whites had enough time to depart from the library. An argument could be made that she's using the majority of her energy to keep herself young, but she still gave the Dothraki enough fire. She states that Beric's purpose has been served, and that, essentially, his destiny was to come here.
You said we'd meet again.
And here we are.
You said I'd shut many eyes forever. You were right about that too.
Brown eyes, green eyes, and blue eyes.
Either the Lord of Light is mentally deficient, or this makes little to no sense. He's been brought back countless times, and the entirety of his arc, his purpose in both the narrative and contextually, is to be needlessly killed by a few whites because tossing his weapon was more time-sparing than not tossing his weapon? Are you kidding me? Arya talks to Melisandre and states that she knows her. Melisandre agreeing. Arya stands from the ground, remembering how Melisandre was the same woman that said she would close many eyes. Brown eyes, green eyes, and blue eyes. Arya, now with the intuition of the moment, realizes what this meant all along. This is by no means a bad interaction because the blue eyes could mean either commoners or whites depending on the context. There's subtext to this dialogue, but as most things in this season, it relies heavily on the earlier seasons to build it up. Not to discount this scene, but this didn't require a lot of thought from the writers. It works, don't get me wrong, but it's still fundamentally highlighting why the earlier seasons are so much better than this. They prepare to battle with the whites through the door when Melisandre asks Arya what we say to the gods of death. Arya replies with, "Not today." Another callback to a better scene. Strangely, she then turns to a different direction and starts running. The Hound and Melisandre both watching this occur, as if these two lines of dialogue changed anything. Maybe she suspects that rushing through that door would have been a suicide mission. We then cut to Theon, who's preparing for the onslaught of whites that's to come. His men grab their bows, hold their stance, and begin firing on the countless enemies that approach. In fact, the number of whites far outweighs the number of people, much like they've been doing in this episode, meaning that this should be the end of the road for the living. Bran is the world's memory. He's the very goal of the Night King. These men are about to be overrun and are reliant on nearly exclusively bows, a long-range weapon. From this shot, it appears that they wouldn't have enough time to whip out their swords if need be, so they're screwed. Theon will be killed because his mind's shot and he lacks any substantial weapon. Bran will be killed because he's crippled and seems reluctant to fight, and thus that's the end. But apparently that doesn't mean anything because we cut away right before they made contact, making whatever was about to occur non-existent. This next section was a point of discord for many people. I've seen people complain about the fact that the Night King in this specific scene did not book it for Bran. The Night King's dragon descends from the clouds and bursts a hole through the side of Winterfell. I'm going to touch on this a little later. Instead of shooting for the target, he decided to turn around and marvel at the fact that his dragon does, in fact, shoot fire. Suddenly, Jon on his dragon swoops in and smacks Viserion, the two aggressively clawing at each other, Theon and his men watching from below. They combat each other for around 30 seconds before Dany hits the Night King off, causing him to plunge into the darkness of the blizzard. He should be dead here. While doing research for this video and trying to locate reasons as to why the Night King did the things he did, there was always one point that kept appearing. The Night King is human, and as such has flaws that can be attributed to humanity. If he is human, the assumption can be made that dropping hundreds of feet would result in your death. To remain unhypocritical, I did state earlier that he has an air of mystery around him, and that we don't know the true extent of his power, so this could potentially be in his repertoire. With that said though, I can't see him surviving this by any means. Jon's plummet is a lot less catastrophic, as his dragon slows down quite like a plane on a runway before slamming the ground, letting Jon be flung off. It takes little time for Dany to locate the Night King, who remains unscathed. Remarkably, they have a brief period where they sort of just look at each other meaningfully, as if that makes any difference. The Night King no longer has his spear, or so we think, rendering him useless against her unless she drops down. Luckily, for now, she stays above ground, yelling Dracarys before she utterly douses him in fire. This happens for a few prolonged seconds, allowing for Jon to enter the scene. But wait, what's this? Dany and Jon seem distraught looking at the fire. It takes a bit, but it's revealed that the Night King is immune to flame. When did this happen? I don't know, because every other White Walker or White is actually more vulnerable to fire than the average person, indicating that this same logic should apply to their leader. There's no substantial difference between them and the average White beyond sentience. Once more, I turned to fandom for answers, and they told me that, quote, just as with the White Walkers under his control, the Night King was immune to fire due to the extreme cold he radiated. This makes sense conceptually, though comes off as an asshole, since every other aspect of this show has made it clear that this should not happen. He should not have this capability. It's only there to build tension and because it looks cool. Then the shot changes to one of the ground, where the spear is. The only reason I didn't make fun of the Night King during this scene is because I was working under the assumption that he didn't have his spear with him. Perhaps it flew far away during his descent. Whatever it was, this changed everything. He has excellent aim and knew it was there, so it's unknown what was stopping him from throwing it in the time they were casually staring at each other. You have the ability to kill the dragon and thus her, and you're not using it. Anyway, he throws the spear and it misses, Dany shooting away so as to not lose another one of her dragons. Seeing the Night King walking away, Jon grips his blade and pulls it out of its sheath, quickly tailing him as he enters Winterfell. This should be the final confrontation. The scene is perfect, a 1v1 with Jon versus the Night King. But the Night King has a trick up his sleeve. In a nod to Hardhome, he turns around and faces Jon, Jon slowing his pace to a crawl. And knowing what will happen next, and that he doesn't have much time, Jon rushes forward to try and reach the Night King before all the dead have been resurrected. The cadaver's eyes slowly open. Not only here, but all over the battle. We see inside the walls of Winterfell that Jaime is watching them all stand up. I understand that there'd be utter bewilderment, but this is still an opportunity for them to strike. The dead are slow when it comes to getting up, so it doesn't make much sense for them not to act at this moment. They're all sort of standing around, watching as it happens. Even little Lyanna Mormont is revived. With everyone up, the Night King feels it's fit to walk away, prompting the Whites to proceed forth to Jon, leaving him stranded and fully surrounded. Before we can see what happens, it cuts away to the entrance of Winterfell. A path is made from the door, White Walkers coming in through the shadows and entering the fortress. The scene cuts to inside the crypt, people noticing that the growling and snarling that could only be heard from outside is now prevailing indoors. From one of the coffins emerges a White, breaking through the stone and standing before Gilly. Sounds of her child sounding around. This makes logical sense. Naturally, the Night King resurrecting the dead would also apply to the dead in the crypt, but what I don't understand is why they didn't both preemptively plan for this or send people to a different location. Furthermore, how are the Whites capable of breaking through the stone? It makes it seem as if the structural integrity of the building is beyond unsound, almost to the point of collapse if someone nudging their hand out from inside the walls can break it. Tyrion orders Sansa to move, allowing the innocent people attempting to get away from the battle to die. We only see a glimpse of this, though I'll get into it more later. Moving back to Theon, none of the Whites are keeping a consistent charge. They're all moving one by one instead of as a line. The same problem with the battle formation before when they were trying to enter the fortress. The same logic, though, applies to Jon, who's doing a fantastic job of clearing the Whites that previously surrounded him. To state it again, they fully surrounded him, leaving him zero leeway. He should be dead, assuming they moved all as one unit, which they were last we saw, so I have no clue how Jon got in the position he's currently in. Anyway, Dany's now here, which means Jon can now go reach his brother and have her fend off the others. For some reason though, as he's running away, Dany decides to dock Drogon on the ground with the Whites, as if she wouldn't be overrun immediately. The solution to this is to stay elevated and not give them a sufficient path to where you are. Dany ignores this and allows her dragon to be utterly torn up. Why? Because it looks cool. And because they needed Dany to fall off her dragon to let Jorah have a heroic moment. We'll get to that in a second. The Whites move high enough on Drogon to warrant her falling off, Drogon walking away and taking flight in an attempt to remove them. This now leaves Dany stranded, only for her to be protected by Jorah at the last moment. They really want you to believe that she's in danger as suggested by the Riser. Actually, it's wrong for me to criticize the score. I'm just letting this episode get to me. The score is absolutely fantastic, and this moment really highlights that. It's insane how many Whites there are and how little people have died. We see Jon walking through the courtyard, watching as people are slain left and right, fending off body after body. For a moment, Jon watches Sam, who's on the ground, stabbing a White and doesn't think to immediately help him. Simply staring, one of the Whites jumps on Sam, Jon not doing anything. This happens once more seconds after with Brienne. Everyone is surrounded and you're the only one with a decent position. Could you not think of anything to do? My assumption is that this was used to create a sense of urgency since the life of his brother is at stake, but it just comes off as selfish. We get more of him walking around and combing through the Whites before switching back to Theon, who's now run out of arrows, his men dying left and right around him. This reveals that they had no other weapon besides the bows and arrows, which is remarkable considering these are the closest people to the main target of the siege. Anyway, Theon has to fend off a few and picks up a spear from the ground, impaling the two that had been chasing him. The same bombardment that's happening here is also occurring in the crypt. People are being slaughtered since they've been given no weaponry, so naturally, where do you think Sansa and Tyrion would be? Hiding. Let me make this clear. They are hiding right now. Oh my god. The Queen of the North and the Hand of the Queen. Oh my god. And they aren't doing a single thing. They aren't even attempting to do a single thing. And these are the Deuterogonists, after all. But then there's this moment of anguish between the two of them, when Sansa pulls a knife from her coat pocket. The score initiates with a soft piano, the two looking at each other and very nearly accepting their fate. Maybe it's the acting, maybe it's the soundtrack, but I absolutely adore this. Following this, there's a slick transition where Tyrion removes himself from behind the slab, and it cuts to Jon performing the same action. The scene is quiet. The actions of the people are diluted by the score, sounding as if it were far away. This is another moment where if you shut your brain off, it's excellent. I have a rant for the ending of this episode, but for now, the show is decent. What makes this not excellent is for the same reasons I've been reiterating through the entire video. Many people should be dying. Jaime and Brienne should now be dead because there are simply too many whites. It's complete and utter bedlam wherever you look. Jon, during the course of this, has to deal with 2 scorches from Viserion, which remarkably don't go through any wall, despite it going through the wall not even 20 minutes prior. Funny how that works. Bran is still warged into the Ravens for some reason, I'm actually not sure. Jorah is cut open with the blade, not even breaking through the armor somehow. Again, I'm actually not sure. Sam, Jaime, and Brienne are somehow still living. Again, I'm actually not sure. But now come the final moments of this episode, what 8 seasons and 9 years of television have been leading up to. I'll complain when it's over. For now, enjoy the scenario. The Night King and his fellow White Walkers enter the Godswood. Only Theon left to defend Bran, despite Jon's efforts. The Whites, that had previously been going for Theon, have now subsided to make way for the Night King to finally succeed in his mission. Theon can only watch, knowing that his life will end in mere moments. Bran calls to him from behind, calling him a good man and thanking him for his efforts, both before and after this moment. A tear falls from Theon's eye before he prepares to charge, gripping his spear and proceeding forth to the Night King. Bran only watches, knowing what will happen next. When the two confront each other, Theon's spear is broken, and a dagger is shot through his chest as if armor means nothing. In fact, that's been a problem with his entire episode. Hell, even these few seasons. Armor has just not meant anything and offers zero support, but I digress. Theon collapses to the floor before switching perspectives to Jon, who rushes towards Viserion before retreating back behind a rock. People have complained about this rock before. This rock should be no more after being incinerated. Jon should be no more after being incinerated. Since people have historically discussed this rock, I won't do so in this video. So, you get my point. Jorah is stabbed numerous times, despite being able to be protected by Dany, who just doesn't, because Jorah needed to die in this episode. D&D had to choose the characters that matter just enough to the audience to be memorable, but not enough to be substantial. You know who also employs this technique? Kids' movies. Piss off show. The Night King steps forward, meeting face to face with Bran. Before I do my final bitch, allow me to explain the scenario to you. There is a wall in the background. Surrounding this wall are whites who cover the entirety of it besides the entrance, which is covered by White Walkers. The Night King isn't near this wall. In fact, you can clearly see the sky above. If someone were to go through the entrance, they'd be killed. If someone were to go through the side, they'd be killed. Thus, with this information, what could possibly happen? Hold that thought. We switch back to Jon, who's still behind the boulder that Viserion couldn't manage to break. He then jumps out and screams at the dragon. Instead of immediately being effectively cremated, the dragon decides to open its mouth a little larger than usual. I don't know why either of these beings are doing this. Jon should be dead. Viserion wouldn't hesitate if it weren't for the fact that this is the climax and that Jon is basically the protagonist at this point. And now, here it is. The scene turns to slow motion when the Night King tries to grab his dagger. One of the White Walkers hears a sound from behind, and suddenly, as if out of thin air, Arya jumps in, yelling, only to be gripped by the neck by the Night King. Luckily, using her powers, learned from the Faceless Men, she lets go of her dagger, picks it up with the other hand, and stabs the Night King, slicing him into smithereens before every other White or White Walker bursts in the same manner as him. This is the finale we've all been waiting for. Now, let me explain why it doesn't work, both narratively, logically, and contextually. Let's start narratively. Arya has nothing to do with this storyline, besides by proxy via Jon. This was not her battle to fight. It was either Bran or Jon, and it would have made more sense if they had a larger say in the battle. The writer said it doesn't feel right to have Jon save the day because it's what the audience expects. It's what we expect because it makes the most sense narratively. Or, au contraire, since you don't like Jon apparently, perhaps work with Bran. It would explain why he's in the Ravens for the entire episode buggering off for some reason. That's still never explained, and it could have been so easily. It's as simple as doing something in the same vein as the Hodor reveal. It's honestly that simple. Logically, as previously stated, this scene is filled with both whites and White Walkers. One of the White Walkers turns around, presumably since they heard a noise from behind, and then sees Arya from ahead. How could she make it from the library to the Godswood this quickly without any interference or injury? Answer: she couldn't, and this setup is as contrived as the library scene. She would have been noticed by one of the White Walkers, who would then order the Whites to kill her. There's no viable opening for her without being noticed, and I understand that the point of her character is that she's stealthy and has assassin training, but not to the point that it literally defies logic entirely. Plus, she was screaming as she was coming in. The audio faded in to make way for the score, which means that she was screaming prior to that, ergo being heard by one of the White Walkers. Furthermore, screaming is not a useful trait for an assassin, so much so that it contradicts that portion of her being. Contextually, we've seen the White Walkers touch people twice. Once in the 4th season of the series, with one of them converting a baby into a white, and another in Bran's vision where the Night King touches his wrist. Judging from the first scene in the show, this should convert someone into a white. An exception could be made for Bran, since that was purely through a vision, though Arya doesn't have that kind of leeway. In the scene with the baby, the White Walker's thumb is pressed against their forehead, causing their eyes to turn blue. Arya, in this scene, is directly gripped on the neck by the Night King. The baby was instantaneously converted, meaning the same logic should be applied to Arya. One may argue that it's not automatic. Perhaps the White Walkers need to focus and actually wish for it to occur rather than it just occurring. Even then, this is a situation in which he'd want it. If this were written by Martin, she would have been immediately converted, and the Night King would then kill Bran. But this isn't written by Martin. I'm reminded in every scene that this wasn't written by Martin. Anyway, Jorah dies, people look around, and the Red Woman walks out of the castle gates only to be watched by Davos, who planned to kill her, though instead simply waits. She removes her collar before aging at light speed and collapsing into the snow. Her purpose was served, and she therefore saw it fit to die. Her magic, the same that was keeping her young, was now exhausted by the fight. She didn't do much at all, but it was served. And then the scene cuts to black before the credits roll. That's it. That was the culmination of 8 seasons of work. Oh my god.